The autumn rain pelted against the windows of Murphy's Diner, a small establishment tucked away on the outskirts of a town that time seemed to have forgotten. Inside, the familiar hum of conversation mixed with the clatter of coffee cups and the sizzle of bacon on the grill. It was Tuesday morning, and the usual crowd had gathered for their daily dose of caffeine and local gossip. At a corner table sat a man whose weathered face told stories that few would believe. His graying hair was neatly combed, and despite wearing simple clothes from the thrift store, he carried himself with a dignity that caught the attention of observant eyes. Had been coming to Murphy's for 3 months now, ever since he'd arrived in with nothing but a worn duffel bag and a determination to start fresh. The other patrons had grown accustomed to his quiet presence. He always ordered black coffee and wheat toast, always said please and thank you, and always left a generous tip despite his modest means. What puzzled them was his habit of standing whenever a police officer or firefighter entered the diner, a small gesture that seemed automatic, almost military in nature. "There goes the mystery man again," whispered the town's self-appointed gossip coordinator as rose to his feet when Officer Bradley walked in. "I'm telling you, there's something off about him. Nobody just shows up in a town like this without a past." Her companion, Bob, who ran the local hardware store, nodded in agreement. "Been asking around about him. Nobody knows where he came from or what he's running from. Could be anything. Could be dangerous." The whispers had been growing louder over the past few weeks. In a town where everyone knew everyone else's business going back 3 generations was an anomaly. Some speculated he was hiding from the law. Others suggested he was probably lying about his name. The more creative minds had crafted elaborate theories about witness protection programs and federal fugitives. Was aware of the speculation, but he had learned long ago that some battles weren't worth fighting. He had come to seeking peace, hoping to find a place where he could live quietly without the weight of his past pressing down on his shoulders. The town had seemed perfect, small enough to disappear in, remote enough to avoid unwanted attention. What the townspeople didn't know was that he'd spent the better part of his life serving his country in ways that couldn't be discussed over morning coffee. His hands, and calloused, had done things that would make headlines if the stories ever came to light. His eyes, which seemed to take in everything while revealing nothing, had seen the worst humanity had to offer and somehow managed to maintain faith in its potential for good. The job market was limited, but had managed to find work at auto repair, owned by his husband, Carl. Mechanical skills were impressive, though he was vague about where he had acquired them. He could diagnose engine problems that stumped Carl, and he had an uncanny ability to repair vehicles with whatever parts were available, improvising solutions that shouldn't have worked but somehow did. "I don't care what people are saying about you," Carl had told him during his 2nd week on the job. "You're the best mechanic I've ever worked with, and you show up on time every day. That's good enough for me." But Carl was in the minority. Most of the town remained suspicious of the newcomer who kept to himself and seemed to have no past worth discussing. The suspicion deepened when people noticed that never talked about family, never received mail, and never made or received phone calls at the garage. The breaking point came during the 3rd week of October, when Tommy, a teenager known for his big mouth and small brain, decided to confront directly. Tommy had been drinking behind the high school with his friends, building up liquid courage for what he thought would be an easy target. "Hey, mystery man," Tommy called out as walked past the group on his way home from work. "We've been wondering about you. What are you hiding? What did you do that made you run to our little town?" Paused but didn't turn around. "I'm not hiding anything, son, just trying to live quietly." "Son," Tommy laughed, his friends joining in. "You hear that, guys? He thinks he's somebody important, probably never even served his country, probably some kind of fraud who's been lying about everything." The accusation hit harder than Tommy could have known. Had dedicated his entire adult life to serving his country, often in situations where recognition was impossible and gratitude was never expected. He had made sacrifices that had cost him relationships, health, and peace of mind. To be called a fraud by a teenager who had never faced real adversity was almost unbearable, but had learned discipline in the hardest school imaginable. He simply nodded and continued walking, leaving Tommy and his friends to celebrate what they perceived as a victory over the town's mysterious stranger. Word of the confrontation spread quickly through sufficient gossip network. By the next morning, Half the town had heard various versions of the story, each more embellished than the last. The consensus seemed to be that it had been exposed as some sort of pretender, someone who had been putting on airs and had finally been called out by a brave local teenager. The atmosphere at Murphy's diner the next morning was thick with tension and satisfied whispers. Took his usual seat, ordered his usual breakfast, and tried to ignore the stares and hushed conversations happening around him. He had faced enemy fire without flinching, but the sustained hostility of an entire community was wearing him down in ways that combat never had. "I heard he claimed to be some kind of war hero," was saying to her breakfast companion, making no effort to lower her voice. "Typical fraud behavior. They always pick stories that can't be." "Probably watched too many movies," added Bob. "Thinks he can come to a small town and impress people with made-up military stories." Finished his coffee, left his usual tip, and stood to leave. As he walked toward the door, the conversations didn't even pause. The town had made up its mind about him, and nothing he could say or do would change their opinion. He was the outsider, the fraud, the mystery man with too many secrets and too few explanations. What none of them knew was that wasn't his real name, but not for the reasons they suspected. He had adopted the identity as part of a witness protection arrangement after his last mission had gone sideways in a way that made him a target for people with long memories and longer reach. The government had offered him a new life in exchange for his silence about operations that officially never happened. As walked through the rain toward his small apartment above the pharmacy, he wondered if coming to had been a mistake. He had hoped to find peace in anonymity, but anonymity in a small town was apparently impossible. Every day brought new suspicion, new speculation, new reasons for the townspeople to view him as an outsider who didn't belong. The apartment was sparse but clean, furnished with the basics that his handler had arranged before his arrival. On the small desk sat a secure phone that hadn't rung in 3 months, not since his last contact with the agency. Sometimes wondered if they had forgotten about him entirely, left him to fade away in this small town like an old photograph in a forgotten drawer. That evening, as he sat by his window watching the rain continue to fall, made a decision. He would give one more week. If the hostility continued, if the suspicion grew worse, he would contact his handler and ask to be relocated somewhere else. Somewhere even more remote, where the chances of running into people who cared about his past would be even smaller. He had sacrificed too much for his country to spend his remaining years being treated like a criminal by people who had never faced real danger. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had spent decades protecting people who would now cross the street to avoid him if they knew who he really was. The rain continued through the night, washing the streets clean while doing nothing to wash away the suspicion and hostility that had taken root in. The man with no past that anyone could verify fell asleep to the sound of water against glass, unaware that his quiet life was about to be shattered by an encounter that would change everything. The morning of October 24th started like any other inn, with the usual crowd gathering at Murphy's diner for coffee and conversation. But there was an undercurrent of excitement that hadn't been there before. Word had spread that Congressman Richard Hayes would be making a campaign stop in town, bringing with him promises of federal funding for infrastructure improvements and job creation. For a town that had been largely ignored by politicians for decades, the visit was significant. The mayor had organized a small reception at the community center, and most of the town's business owners had closed their shops early to attend. It was the kind of event that would be talked about for years to come, regardless of whether any of the promises made would actually be kept. Had heard about the visit but had no intention of attending. Political rallies held no appeal for him, especially given his current status as the town pariah. He was content to spend his evening working on the engine of Mrs. Ancient Ford pickup, a puzzle that had been challenging him for the better part of the week. The problem with the truck was intermittent and complex, the kind that separated good mechanics from great ones. Had traced the issue through multiple systems, ruling out obvious causes and diving deeper into the electrical components. It was methodical work that required patience and expertise, qualities he had developed over years of troubleshooting much more complex systems under considerably more pressure. As he worked, found himself thinking about his decision to leave. Part of him was relieved at the prospect of starting over somewhere else, but another part was disappointed that he hadn't been able to make it work here. The town had everything he was looking for: quiet streets, friendly faces, and the kind of anonymity that came with being just another resident in a place where nothing much happened. The irony was that his very desire for anonymity had made him conspicuous. In a community where everyone knew everyone else's story, his lack of a story had become his defining characteristic. He was the man with no past, and that made him more memorable than if he had been the most colorful character in town. Around 6 in the evening, as was closing up the garage, he heard the sound of sirens in the distance. At first, he assumed it was the usual emergency response, someone's barn catching fire or a fender bender on Main Street. But the sirens kept coming, more of them than usually heard in a month, all seeming to converge on the same location. Curiosity got the better of him and walked to the front of the garage to see what was happening. Down the street, he could see the flashing lights of multiple emergency vehicles surrounding the community center. People were running in different directions, some toward the building and others away from it. The organized campaign event had clearly turned into something else entirely. His instincts kicked in immediately. Years of training had taught him to assess situations quickly and respond accordingly. The pattern of emergency response suggested a serious incident, possibly violence, possibly medical, but definitely something that required immediate attention from people with the right skills and experience. He locked up the garage and walked toward the community center, moving against the flow of people who were leaving the area. As he got closer, he could see that the situation was more serious than he had initially thought. An ambulance was pulled up to the front entrance, and paramedics were wheeling someone out on a stretcher. Police officers were establishing a perimeter, and the crowd that had gathered for the political rally was being moved back to a safe distance. "What happened?" asked a woman who was standing near the police tape. "Someone collapsed during the speech," she replied, her voice shaking. "The congressman, I think, they're saying it might be a heart attack." Process the information quickly. A cardiac event in a crowded building, with limited medical resources and a patient who would likely need immediate transport to a major medical facility. His volunteer fire department was competent, but they were dealing with equipment that was older than most of the people using it, and the nearest hospital with a cardiac unit was 40 miles away. He moved closer to the perimeter, trying to get a better view of the situation. The paramedics were working on the patient, but even from a distance, could see that they were struggling. Their movements were urgent but seemed uncoordinated, suggesting that they were dealing with something beyond their usual experience level. "We need to get him to Memorial Hospital," one of the paramedics was saying to the police officer in charge. "But our ambulance is having engine trouble. It started overheating on the way here, and I don't think it'll make the trip." Stepped forward without thinking. "I can fix that." The police officer, someone didn't recognize, looked at him suspiciously. "And you are?" "I work at auto repair. I can diagnose and fix whatever's wrong with your ambulance." The paramedic looked desperate. "We don't have time for a full repair. This man needs to be in a cardiac unit within the hour or we're going to lose him." "Let me take a look," said, already walking toward the ambulance. "I might be able to get you enough power to make the trip." The police officer started to protest, but the paramedic cut him off. "At this point, we don't have a choice. The backup ambulance is 30 minutes out, and this patient doesn't have 30 minutes. Opened the hood of the ambulance and immediately identified the problem. A cracked radiator hose was causing the cooling system to fail, which would lead to engine overheating and eventually complete breakdown. It was a relatively simple problem with a complex solution, given the tools and materials available. "I need a sharp knife, some electrical tape, and a plastic bottle," he said, his voice calm and authoritative. "And someone needs to keep the engine running while I work." The paramedics looked at each other uncertainly. What was proposing sounded like a field repair, something that might work temporarily, but wasn't the kind of thing you'd want to rely on for a 40-mile emergency transport. "Trust me," said, meeting the lead paramedic's eyes. "I've fixed worse things under worse conditions. This will get you there." Something in his voice convinced them. Within minutes, had improvised a temporary repair using materials scavenged from the ambulance's emergency kit. He bypassed the damaged section of hose, created a temporary seal using techniques he had learned in situations where failure meant death, and tested the cooling system to ensure it would hold under stress. "That should get you there and back," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. "But get the hose replaced as soon as you can. This is a temporary fix." The paramedics loaded their patient and prepared to leave. As the ambulance pulled away with its lights flashing and sirens wailing, found himself surrounded by a crowd of townspeople who had witnessed the entire episode. For the first time since arriving in, he was the center of attention for positive reasons. "Where did you learn to do that?" asked Carl, who had rushed over from the political rally when he heard about the emergency. Shrugged, "You pick things up over the years." But the crowd wasn't satisfied with vague answers. They had just watched their town's supposed fraud perform what looked like a miracle repair under pressure, potentially saving the life of a congressman in the process. The quiet mechanic with no past had just demonstrated skills that suggested a very different kind of background than anyone had imagined. "That wasn't luck," said Officer Bradley, who had worked with emergency services long enough to recognize expertise when he saw it. "That was training, military training if I had to guess." Didn't confirm or deny the observation. He had said too much already, revealed too much of himself in the heat of the moment. The smart thing to do would be to deflect the attention and disappear back into the anonymity he had worked so hard to maintain. But as he looked around at the faces of the people who had spent months treating him with suspicion and hostility, saw something different. There was respect there, and curiosity, but also a kind of recognition. They were beginning to understand that their assumptions about the mysterious newcomer might have been wrong. The crowd began to disperse as the immediate crisis passed, but several people approached individually to thank him for his quick thinking. Who had been one of his harshest critics actually apologized for the things she had said about him. "I judged you unfairly," she admitted, looking genuinely embarrassed. "I should have given you the benefit of the doubt instead of listening to gossip and rumors." Accepted her apology gracefully, but he knew that the evening's events had created a new problem. The attention he had been trying to avoid was now focused directly on him. People would have questions, and some of those questions might be dangerous to answer. As he walked home that night, realized that his quiet life-in was over, one way or another. The skills he had displayed, the expertise he had revealed, would not go unnoticed or unexamined. In trying to help save a life, he had potentially exposed himself to the very dangers he had come here to escape. But for the first time in months, felt like he had done something that mattered. The congressman would survive because had been willing to step forward when help was needed. Sometimes, he reflected, the right choice wasn't the safe choice, and living a life worth living meant being willing to take risks for the right reasons. The news of Congressman Hayes's recovery spread through like wildfire, and with it, the story of heroic repair work grew more dramatic with each telling. By the time the local newspaper published its account 3 days later, had apparently performed surgery on the ambulance engine with nothing but a paperclip and sheer determination. Tried to downplay his role whenever anyone brought it up, but the town wouldn't let him. Suddenly, everyone wanted to know more about the quiet mechanic who had appeared from nowhere and saved the day. The suspicion that had characterized their attitude toward him began to transform into curiosity, and then into something approaching admiration. Carl found himself fielding calls from people asking about his mysterious employee. "I always knew there was more to him than met the eye," Carl told anyone who would listen, conveniently forgetting that he had hired more out of desperation than insight. "You can tell a lot about a man by how he handles pressure, and handled it like a professional." The problem was indeed a professional, just not in the way that anyone in could imagine. His real expertise lay in areas that couldn't be discussed over coffee at Murphy's Diner, in operations that had no official record and accomplishments that would never be publicly acknowledged. The ambulance repair had been simple compared to some of the mechanical challenges he had faced in hostile territories around the world. 3 days after the incident, was working alone in the garage when he heard a car pull up outside. The engine sound was different from the usual vehicles that came through, smoother, more powerful, and maintained with military precision. Looked up to see a black sedan with government plates parking in front of the garage. His blood ran cold. After 3 months of blessed anonymity, his cover had apparently been blown by a single moment of instinctive heroism. He had known this day might come, but he had hoped for more time to build a life that was worth protecting. The man who got out of the sedan was exactly what expected, tall, lean, wearing a suit that looked expensive but not flashy, with the kind of alertness that came from years of training and experience. He approached the garage with the measured stride of someone who was comfortable in potentially dangerous situations. The man asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Depends on who's asking," replied, not looking up from the engine he was working on. The man smiled slightly. "My name is David, and I work for a government agency that doesn't exist. We need to talk." Set down his tools and wiped his hands on a shop rag. "I figured this day would come eventually. I just hoped it would be later rather than sooner." Looked around the garage, taking in the organized workspace and the evidence of skilled mechanical work. "You've done good work here. Carl tells me you're the best mechanic he's ever employed." High praise from a man who's been fixing cars for 30 years. "It's honest work," said. "I've enjoyed the change of pace." "I'm sure you have, but your little ambulance repair show has attracted some attention. The kind of attention that makes people ask questions about the man who performed what looked like a miracle under pressure." Had been expecting this conversation ever since the night of the incident. The skills he had displayed, while impressive to the civilians were exactly the kind of field improvisation that would be recognized by people with the right background and training. "So what happens now?" asked. "Do I get relocated again? New name, new town, new life to build from scratch?" Shook his head. "Actually, we have a different proposition. There's been a development in the situation that brought you here in the first place. The people who were looking for you have been neutralized permanently. Your witness protection status is no longer necessary." The news hit like a physical blow. For 3 months, he had been living with the constant low-level stress of knowing that dangerous people were looking for him, that his safety depended on maintaining an identity that wasn't his own. The idea that the threat was gone, that he was finally free to live openly, was almost too much to process. "You're sure?" he asked. "Completely sure. The operation that made you a target has been, and the people involved have either been arrested or eliminated. Your real identity is no longer a liability." Sat down heavily on a nearby stool. The relief was overwhelming, but it brought with it a new set of questions. If he was no longer the mysterious mechanic with no past, who was he? Could he reclaim his real identity after months of living as someone else? "There's more," continued. "Your former commanding officer has been asking about you. General, she's heard about your situation and wants to meet with you." The name hit like a thunderbolt. General had been more than his commanding officer. She had been his mentor, his advocate, and the closest thing to family he had ever known in the military. She had fought for him when others wanted to use him as a scapegoat, and she had made sure he received the protection he needed when his final mission went wrong. "The general wants to see me?" asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "She's been concerned about you. The witness protection arrangement was necessary, but it meant cutting all ties with your previous life. She's been waiting for the all-clear to reestablish contact." Tried to process what he was hearing. General was alive, she knew about his situation, and she wanted to reconnect with him. After months of isolation and anonymity, the possibility of seeing someone who knew who he really was seemed almost too good to be true. "When?" he asked. "She's actually in the area. There's a Veterans Day ceremony at the state capitol tomorrow, and she's one of the speakers. She could make a detour through if you're interested in seeing her." Didn't hesitate. "Tell her yes. Tell her I'd be honored to see her again." Smiled, the first genuinely warm expression had seen from him. "I thought you might say that. She'll be here tomorrow afternoon around 3 o'clock. Fair warning, though, she's bringing some other people with her. People who want to meet the man who performed miracles in places that don't officially exist." After left, found himself unable to concentrate on his work. The prospect of seeing General again brought back a flood of memories from his previous life. Missions accomplished against impossible odds, comrades lost in service to their country, and the satisfaction that came from doing work that made a real difference in the world. He also thought about how he would explain his real identity to the people of. For months, they had known him as the quiet mechanic with mysterious skills. How would they react when they learned that his real name was Colonel James Mitchell, retired Special Operations, recipient of medals that couldn't be publicly acknowledged for operations that officially never happened? The next morning, word spread through that had visitors coming, important visitors, based on the black sedans that had been seen around town. The speculation reached new heights when someone spotted military license plates on one of the vehicles. At Murphy's diner, the conversation was more animated than it had been in months. Who had become something of a champion for since the ambulance incident, was holding court with her theories about his background. I'm telling you he's somebody important, she insisted to anyone who would listen. You don't get government cars and military visitors if you're just a regular mechanic. That man has a story, and I think we're about to hear it. Spent the morning trying to work, but his mind kept wandering to the afternoon's meeting. He hadn't seen General in over a year, not since the debriefing that had ended his military career and started his journey toward witness protection. She had been the one constant in his adult life, the person who had believed in him when others doubted, who had given him opportunities to serve his country in ways that few people ever could. At exactly 3 o'clock, a convoy of 3 black vehicles pulled up in front of auto repair. Watched through the window as several people got out, but his attention was focused entirely on the woman emerging from the middle vehicle. General looked exactly as he remembered her, tall, commanding, with silver hair and eyes that missed nothing. She wore her dress uniform, and even at a distance, could see the impressive array of ribbons and decorations that told the story of a distinguished military career. But what struck him most was the smile on her face as she looked toward the garage. It was the smile of someone who was genuinely happy to see an old friend, not the professional courtesy of a superior officer dealing with a subordinate. Walked out to meet her, his heart pounding with an emotion he couldn't quite identify. As she approached, General did something that surprised everyone watching. She opened her arms and embraced him like a son she hadn't seen in years. "Hello, Jimmy," she said, using the nickname she had called him during their years of working together. "It's good to see you again." Or rather, Colonel James Mitchell, the moment was overwhelming. For the first time in months, someone was looking at him with full knowledge of who he really was, what he had accomplished, and what he had sacrificed for his country. The isolation that had defined his time in suddenly lifted, replaced by the warmth of recognition and respect. "Hello, General," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "It's good to see you too." As they stood there, embracing in front of the auto repair shop, a crowd began to gather. The people had never seen their mysterious mechanic show such emotion, and they certainly had never seen him treated with such obvious respect and affection by someone who was clearly a high-ranking military officer. The questions that had been building for months were about to be answered, and the truth would be more remarkable than any of the theories that had been circulating through the town's gossip network. The crowd that had gathered around auto repair grew larger by the minute as word spread through that something significant was happening. People emerged from businesses, left their homes, and abandoned their afternoon activities to witness what appeared to be a reunion of considerable importance. General stepped back from her embrace but kept her hands on his shoulders as she looked him over with the practiced eye of someone who had spent decades evaluating the condition of soldiers under her command. "You look good, Jimmy," she said with genuine warmth. "Different but good. Civilian life seems to agree with you." Managed a smile. "It's been an adjustment, ma'am, but the people here have been kind to me." He gestured toward the growing crowd of townspeople who were watching the exchange with fascination and confusion. General turned to address the crowd, her military bearing evident even in this informal setting. "Ladies, and I apologize for the disruption to your afternoon. My name is General, and I've come to visit an old friend." "General," called out, stepping forward with the boldness that came from being the town's unofficial spokesperson. "We've been wondering about here for months. He's been good to us, fixed our cars, helped out when we needed it, but he's never talked much about his background." The general smiled. "That sounds like Jimmy. He was never one to boast about his accomplishments, even when those accomplishments were extraordinary." Carl pushed through the crowd, his face flushed with excitement and confusion. "General, ma'am, has been working for me these past few months. Best mechanic I've ever employed, and that's saying something. But I have to admit, we've all been curious about where he learned his skills." General looked at a question in her eyes. He nodded slightly, giving her permission to share what she felt appropriate. "What I can tell you," the general began, "is that the man you know as is actually Colonel James Mitchell, one of the finest officers I've ever had the privilege of commanding. He served his country with distinction for over 20 years, often in situations where recognition was impossible and gratitude couldn't be expressed publicly." A murmur ran through the crowd. Colonel James Mitchell. The name sounded more substantial than carried more weight, suggested a history of significance and achievement. "Colonel," repeated Officer Bradley, who had been watching from the edge of the crowd. What branch, sir? Special operations, General replied. Colonel Mitchell specialized in, shall we say, unconventional problem-solving in challenging environments. The skills you've seen him demonstrate here, the mechanical expertise, the ability to improvise solutions under pressure, those were developed during missions that required improvisation as a matter of survival. Tommy, the teenager who had confronted weeks earlier, pushed forward through the crowd. His face was red with embarrassment as he approached the man he had called a fraud. Sir, Tommy said, his voice barely audible, I owe you an apology. I said some things. I called you names. I didn't know. Looked down at the young man who had caused him so much pain with his accusations. Instead of anger or satisfaction, he felt only compassion for someone who was learning a difficult lesson about making assumptions. You couldn't have known, said gently. And you were just looking out for your community. That's not something to apologize for, son. General watched the exchange with approval. That's the Jimmy I remember, always more concerned about others than about himself. She turned back to the crowd. What happened here a few days ago, when Colonel Mitchell repaired your ambulance under emergency conditions, wasn't luck or mechanical intuition. It was the result of years of training and experience in situations where mechanical failure could mean the difference between life and death for entire units. But General, said Bob, why was he here? Why was a colonel working as a mechanic in our little town? General's expression grew more serious. Without going into classified details, Colonel Mitchell's last mission resulted in him becoming a target for people who didn't appreciate his success in disrupting their operations. He was placed in witness protection for his own safety while we dealt with the threat. The crowd absorbed this information in stunned silence. Their quiet mechanic wasn't just a former military officer. He was someone who had been important enough and effective enough to make dangerous enemies. The threat has been neutralized, General continued, which is why I can be here today and why Colonel Mitchell is free to reclaim his real identity if he chooses to do so. Felt the weight of dozens of eyes on him, waiting to see how he would respond to this revelation. For months, he had been the mysterious stranger with no past. Now he was being offered the chance to become James Mitchell again, to reclaim the identity and accomplishments that had defined his adult life. I need to tell you something, said, addressing the crowd that had gathered around him. When I first came to, I was running from more than just physical danger. I was running from the weight of a life spent in places where good people do terrible things because they have to. I was tired of carrying secrets that couldn't be shared and accomplishments that couldn't be acknowledged. He paused, gathering his thoughts. You've all been suspicious of me, and you had every right to be. I was lying about who I was, even if I had good reasons for it. But in these past few months, living among you, working alongside you, I've learned something important about what it means to be part of a community. Stepped forward, tears in her eyes. We're the ones who should be apologizing. We judged you, gossiped about you, treated you like an outsider when you were just trying to find a place to belong. You were protecting your community, replied. That's exactly what you should have been doing. I respect that, even if it was difficult to live with. General had been listening to this exchange with growing satisfaction. This is why I wanted to come here personally, she said to the crowd. Not just to see Jimmy again, but to meet the people who gave him a place to rebuild his life. A community that looks out for each other, even when it means being suspicious of strangers, is a community worth being part of. Carl stepped forward, his face flushed with emotion. Colonel Mitchell, sir, I hope this doesn't mean you'll be leaving us. I know we didn't make things easy for you at first, but you've become part of this place. We need you here. Looked around at the faces surrounding him, people who had viewed him with suspicion just hours ago, but who were now looking at him with respect, admiration, and something that might have been affection. The transformation was remarkable, but it raised questions about what came next. I don't know, admitted. I came here to disappear to find a quiet place where I could live without the weight of my past, but things have changed. The threats that brought me here are gone, and my real identity is no longer a secret that needs protecting. General placed a hand on his shoulder. Jimmy, you've spent 20 years serving your country in shadows, handling problems that no one else could handle. You've earned the right to choose what comes next. If you want to stay here, live quietly, fix cars, and be part of this community, no one would question that choice. But, asked, sensing there was more. But there are still problems that need solving, still situations that require your particular set of skills. Not necessarily in foreign countries or combat zones, but here at home, places where your experience and expertise could make a real difference. The offer hung in the air between them, unspoken but understood. Could stay in, continue his quiet life as a mechanic, and put his military past behind him permanently. Or he could return to a life of service, using his skills in new ways to continue making a difference in the world. As he considered his options, looked around at the faces of the people who had become his neighbors, and in some cases his friends. 3 months ago, he had been looking for a place to disappear. Now he was being offered the chance to reemerge, to step back into a life of purpose and significance. The decision, he realized, would define not just his future, but his understanding of who he really was and what kind of life was worth living. The quiet mechanic and the decorated colonel were both part of him now, and he needed to find a way to honor both identities as he moved forward. The afternoon sun was beginning to cast long shadows across the parking lot of auto repair as the crowd continued to grow. Word had spread throughout and beyond, drawing people from neighboring towns who had heard that something extraordinary was happening in their quiet corner of the world. General had been joined by several other military personnel who had emerged from the convoy of vehicles. Among them was a young captain who approached with obvious nervousness and excitement. "Colonel Mitchell, sir," the captain said, snapping to attention and rendering a sharp salute. "Captain Sarah Williams, sir. I've read about your operations in the classified briefings. It's an honor to meet you." The salute was like an electric shock through the crowd of civilians. They had been told that was a colonel, but seeing the formal military respect being shown to their quiet mechanic made his former rank and status suddenly real and immediate. Returned the salute with the automatic precision of someone who had done so thousands of times. For a moment, the transformation was complete. The humble mechanic disappeared, replaced by the bearing and authority of a senior military officer. "At ease, Captain," said, his voice carrying a tone of command that no one had ever heard from him before. "Thank you for the kind words about the operations. But remember, success in special operations is always a team effort. I was just one part of many successful missions." General watched this exchange with satisfaction. "Jimmy, I'd like you to meet the rest of my staff. They're all eager to hear your thoughts on some current challenges we're facing." As was introduced to the other military personnel, the crowd of townspeople found themselves witnessing something remarkable. Their mysterious mechanic was being treated not just with respect, but with the kind of deference usually reserved for genuine heroes. These were clearly experienced military professionals, and they were looking at like he was a legend. "Colonel Mitchell," said another officer, a major with intelligence insignia, "your improvised repairs in the Hindu Kush Mountains are still taught as case studies in field engineering. The way you kept that convoy operational with nothing but spare parts and determination saved 17 lives." Shifted uncomfortably at the praise. "We did what the situation required, Major, nothing more, nothing less." But the crowd was beginning to understand that their quiet neighbor had been involved in operations of genuine significance. The Hindu Kush Mountains meant Afghanistan, and keeping a convoy operational in that terrain suggested combat conditions and life-or-death stakes. Tommy, who had been standing at the back of the crowd since his earlier apology, pushed forward again. This time, his approach was different, respectful, almost reverent. "Colonel Mitchell, sir," Tommy said, his voice stronger than before. "I want to enlist. After I graduate next year, I want to serve my country like you did. Would you? Would you be willing to talk to me about what that means?" Looked at the young man who had called him a fraud just weeks earlier. Tommy's face showed a maturity that hadn't been there before, a recognition that he had encountered something larger than his small-town experience had prepared him for. "Service means sacrifice, son," replied. "It means putting the needs of others before your own, often in situations where no one will ever know what you've done or appreciate the cost of doing it. But if you're serious about it, if you understand what you're committing to, then yes, I'd be happy to talk with you." General had been watching this interaction with growing interest. She stepped forward and addressed Tommy directly. "Young man, if Colonel Mitchell is willing to mentor you, you should consider yourself fortunate. He has a gift for developing young soldiers into exceptional operators. Some of the finest officers in special operations today learned their craft under his guidance." The revelation added another layer to his background. He hadn't just been a soldier. He had been a teacher, a mentor, someone who had shaped the careers and characters of other military personnel. Carl, who had been mostly quiet during the afternoon's revelations, finally found his voice. "Colonel Mitchell, sir, I have to ask, are you going to leave us? I understand if you have to, given what we've learned about your background, but I hope you'll consider staying. We've got a lot more to learn from you." The question that Carl had voiced was clearly on everyone's mind. Now that real identity had been revealed, now that the military had come to reclaim one of their own, would the man they had come to know and respect be taken away from them? Looked around at the faces of the people who had become his community, even when they didn't trust him. He saw Carl, who had given him work when no one else would, who had apologized for her suspicions and gossip. Officer Bradley, who had recognized his military training even when others saw only a mysterious stranger. Tommy, who wanted to follow in his footsteps despite having once mocked him. "General," said, turning to face his former commanding officer, "what exactly are you offering me?" General smiled. "Several options, actually. You could return to active duty, though given your years of service, that would be entirely voluntary. You could work as a civilian contractor, handling situations that require your particular expertise. Or," she paused for effect, "you could consider a training position. We're establishing a new facility for unconventional warfare training, and we need someone with your experience to lead the program." "Where would this training facility be located?" asked, though something in the general's expression suggested he might already know the answer. "We're looking at several sites in rural areas, places where training exercises won't attract unwanted attention. This region has been identified as one of the possibilities. The local community would need to be supportive, of course, and we'd need someone with established ties to the area to serve as a liaison." The implications were clear. Could stay in, continue to be part of the community that had become his home, while also returning to a life of service and purpose. It was a solution that honored both sides of his identity, the quiet civilian who had found peace in a small town, and the career soldier who still had contributions to make. "There's something else," General continued. "The training facility would bring jobs to the area. Security personnel, administrative staff, maintenance crews, all positions that would be filled by local hearing whenever possible. This community that gave you shelter could benefit significantly from such a facility." Looked at Carl. "What do you think, Carl? How would the town feel about having a military training facility nearby?" Carl's face lit up with excitement. "Are you kidding? The jobs alone would transform this place, and having you in charge of it. Colonel Mitchell, that would be an honor for our entire community." Similar expressions of enthusiasm were spreading through the crowd. The economic benefits were obvious, but there was something more, a sense of pride that their town would be associated with something important, something that served the national interest. "I need some time to think about it," said. "This is a big decision, and I want to make sure I'm choosing for the right reasons." General nodded. "Take all the time you need. But Jimmy, remember that the best decisions are usually the ones that allow you to serve others while being true to yourself. You've spent months trying to be someone you're not. Now you have a chance to be exactly who you are in a place where people know and appreciate your real value." As the afternoon wore on and the formal meetings concluded, many of the townspeople approached individually. Some wanted to apologize for their earlier suspicions. Others wanted to express their gratitude for his service. A few, like Tommy, wanted to talk about their own futures and how they might follow his example of service. That evening, after the military convoy had departed and the crowd had dispersed, found himself alone in the garage where he had spent so many quiet hours over the past 3 months. The tools and equipment were the same, but everything else had changed. He was no longer the mysterious mechanic with no past. He was Colonel James Mitchell, a man with a distinguished military career and a future full of possibilities. The decision he faced wasn't really about choosing between civilian and military life. It was about finding a way to integrate all aspects of his identity into a life that honored his past while building something meaningful for the future. 3 days later, called General with his answer. He would accept the position leading the new training facility, with the understanding that he would continue to live in and maintain his connections to the community that had given him refuge when he needed it most. The announcement was met with celebration throughout the town. Auto repair would continue operating, though would need to hire additional mechanics to handle the workload while he divided his time between the garage and the training facility. On Veterans Day, 1 month after the incident that had changed everything, held its first official Veterans Day ceremony in over a decade. Colonel James Mitchell was the keynote speaker, addressing a crowd that included not only townspeople, but also veterans from throughout the region who had come to hear the legendary Special Operations officer speak. In his speech, talked about the meaning of service, both military and civilian. He spoke about the importance of community, about the value of giving people the benefit of the doubt, and about the truth that heroes could be found in the most unlikely places, doing the most ordinary things, until the moment came when they were called upon to be extraordinary. As he concluded his remarks, looked out at the crowd and saw the faces of people who had become family to him. Carl, who had given him work and purpose, who had taught him about the power of community gossip, both destructive and protective. Officer Bradley, who had recognized something in him even when others were suspicious. Tommy, who was preparing for military service with as his mentor. The journey that had begun with suspicion and ended with respect had taught everyone involved valuable lessons about judgment, community, and the complexity of human identity. The man they had mocked as a fraud had turned out to be more genuine than any of them had imagined, and in discovering his true identity, they had discovered something important about their own capacity for understanding and acceptance. Had been a disguise, a necessary fiction that had allowed a wounded warrior to find healing in anonymity. Colonel James Mitchell was the truth, a reality that honored both his past service and his future potential. But perhaps the most important truth was that both identities could coexist, creating a life that was both peaceful and purposeful, both humble and heroic. In the end, the town had gained more than just a training facility and the economic benefits it would bring. They had gained a deeper understanding of the complexity of human identity and the importance of looking beyond surface appearances to find the truth that lay beneath. And had gained something equally valuable, a community that knew who he really was and valued him not despite his extraordinary background, but because of the ordinary kindness he had shown them when he could have remained anonymous forever.